McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. National NFL columnist, FanRag Sports NFL. He's got all the latest NFL news and notes every day on the Sports Bash. Your NFL Fix. It's our homage to like a mandatory Metallica segment. Mandatory NFL, PT. Gotta have it.
Gotta have it every single day. I'm doing my homework assignment, by the way, the one we talked about. Remember you gave me some homework? I'm efforting.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I
was actually going to get John to
get a little traction
get into
there.
that conversation.
And here's why. I'll just say it. I emailed our person with the Eagles. He said, directed me to somebody with the league. The person with the league happens to be Alex Zirkle, who used to do PR for the Philadelphia Eagles. So, yeah, Alex and I had a few chats while waiting for Chip Kelly to come out and
that's nice.
Get angry at us.
Let's bring John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, FanRag Sports NFL. A lot of news today, John. Let's dive into what we're hearing. Of course, this time, I guess you can take with a grain of salt. There's a lot of agent speak out there. But let's start with the Chris Mortensen report at the top here. Brandin Cooks is a guy who's an interesting name. He kind of fits the bill. I don't know. I don't see a fit in terms of a deal, but what say you?
No, it's tough to find a fit for a deal because, remember, Brandin Cooks is still under his rookie contract. So basically he's very cost-friendly at this point, about $1.56 million. You would think a trade would come with a renegotiation and extension, and maybe that's the way you kind of fit it in. But the Saints have their own salary cap problems. And if you think about the players the Eagles would like to move, the Michael Kendricks of the world, the Connor Barwins. The Saints certainly need help defensively, but those guys make a lot of money, and it would be tough to take that on for the Saints, and even Jason Kelsey, if you think about it from the offensive side of the football. So, and then you throw the other curve into it is that the Tennessee Titans are also supposedly involved with the Brandin Cooks talks, and if they're willing to give up the 18th pick in the draft, well, that's going to be tough for the Eagles to match.
Yeah, I would agree that if Tennessee's involved in the same conversations you are, they have more ammunition. The only guy I can think of that could maybe start a conversation would be Kendricks, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're so desperate defensively. I mean, they could use Barwin as well. They could certainly use pass rushers. Cam Jordan's the only guy, seemingly over the past 4 or 5 years, that can get to the quarterback in New Orleans. So, I mean, they could use help at all three levels. But, yeah, if you look at their defense and scheme-wise, Kendricks would be the best fit. Problem is, he didn't play last year, basically. I mean, he's playing less than 25% of the time, and even though he has a decent skill set that we always talk about, it's tough to say, hey, take our garbage, so to speak, that we didn't think that was good enough to play, and give us your 1,200-yard receiver, who makes less money, by the way. I mean, if Howie can pull that one off, that would be another feather in this cap.
John McMullen with us, our Eagles 97.3 ESPN insider. John, that report indicated that they're intent on improving their defense, and you have to wonder if they're intent enough to part with a guy like Cooks for a player who maybe isn't as productive.
Well, yeah, I mean, they have to improve their defense, and that's been the mantra in New Orleans year after year after year. Basically, I joke they should hire Jeff Fisher when they get rid of Sean Payton, because they've finished 7-9, 7-9, 7-9 3 consecutive years. And it's not because Drew Brees can't throw the football, because he's always near 5,000 yards. It's because that defense has been terrible. They can't stop anybody. So they're constantly talking about improving their defense. And that's why, yeah, I mean, certain guys like Kendricks and Barwin would project to be starters on their team, but it doesn't mean because you're desperate to get better defensively that you give up a player of Cook's ability for players that aren't nearly as good. So on paper, it doesn't look to be a fit. But we've seen it last year. I recall talking on this very show about how it would be impossible to trade Byron Maxwell coming off that deal that the Eagles signed him to, and lo and behold, how we found a way to do it. But that was more of a dump when you think about acquiring a player who has produced like Brandin Cooks. That's a whole different ballgame.
John McMullen with us here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. So, John, there's reports with Alshon Jeffrey again, and his name being mentioned. What's the percentage chance that Alshon Jeffrey becomes a Philadelphia Eagle?
I would put it very low, in the 20-25% range. Obviously, it's a fit for what the Eagles need, but that's the top receiver on the board in free agency, and you see some of the numbers certain teams have under the salary cap. And as we speak today, and we keep waiting for the other shoes to drop for the Eagles, only two teams, the Dallas Cowboys and the San Diego Chargers, have less money to work with than the Philadelphia Eagles. So it's hard to believe that they could win a bidding war for a player of the caliber of Alshon Jeffrey.
We're talking with John McMullen here. How about the Chase Daniels stuff? Some reports that he's drawing trade interest, which I find to be a little odd. He's the highest paid backup player in the league, $21 million over 3 years. He signed that last season. What would teams be trying to accomplish by adding a player like Chase Daniel?
Yeah, I think you mentioned, Mike, about agent-driven. I think that's more agent-driven than anything else, in the hope that somebody, whether it be the New York Jets, the Buffalo Bills, the Chicago Bears, maybe even the San Francisco 49ers, go through plan A, plan B, plan C. It doesn't work out for them, and they say, hey, maybe Chase Daniel could be a bridge quarterback as a starter, because it's hard to imagine anybody paying Chase Daniel that amount of money, which is basically $8 million, $5 of that guaranteed, to be a backup quarterback. And I think people kind of forget, no matter what the Eagles say, if you go back to when they signed Chase Daniel, Doug Peterson didn't really have a dossier, so to speak, on Sam Bradford. I don't think he was sold on Sam Bradford. And I think they signed Chase Daniel to compete and potentially be the starting quarterback. Then when they got to off-season work, it was pretty clear pretty quickly that Sam was a lot better. And all of a sudden you're stuck with a backup that you guaranteed $12 million to. It was a bad contract, and we don't often say that with Howie Roseman, but that's one you can criticize him for.
John, the last time we saw Carson Wentz throw a football was when he hit one of the NFL Network interns, I think Super Bowl week. But do you have any concern with the Philadelphia Inquirer report that Carson Wentz developed soreness and pain in his right elbow during the 2016 season, and that maybe that was caused by, or likely caused by, his mechanical issues?
Well, in a way, you would almost hope it's true, because if you think about late last season, I mentioned a number of times on the show just the lack of arm strength when Carson was trying to push the ball down the field, especially as he was scrambling, trying to extend plays. In a certain sense, I wish he did have a sore elbow, because maybe that would explain sort of the dead ball, whether it be dead arm, elbow pain, whatever you want to call it. It's good to have a reason for that happening. Now, Howie Roseman was on another radio station after that report came out, and his answer was, not true, not true, not true, not true. And he said it 4 times. So does somebody who throws the football 607 times, his arm better be sore, but whether it's related to mechanics, it's something the Eagles claim they're not concerned about.
John McMullen's with us. A lot of Eagles news out there, as we talked about Daniels, Jeffrey, Brandin Cooks. You're going to hear a lot of this stuff as we get ready. And also tomorrow is when they do that coin flip. We'll find out when they finally find out where they're going to be picking in the draft. But
We'll finally find out.
We're going to get all the insight on that. Doug Peterson yesterday, he said he expected Kelsey to come back. On the flip side, it didn't sound like Howie Roseman was on the same page. It sounded like another situation where Roseman and Peterson came out and spoke on the same day at the same time and didn't talk to each other beforehand.
Yeah, there were a couple of those instances, and you're right. There is that disconnect, and they don't often they contradict each other at times. There's no other way to say it.
Yeah, we don't think Kelsey's going to be coming back. Oh, yes, we do think Kelsey. I mean, it was just like blatant almost.
Well, it's not. Howie didn't say he wasn't coming back, but obviously it's up in the air because this is a team that needs money, and if they do, for instance, want to make a run at Alshon Jeffrey, well, they got to create the space to do it, and he would be one of the potential salary cap casualties of that. I think where Doug kind of missteps, not necessarily that they're not on the same page. I think, and you can only speculate, is that what he said or what he meant is that he'd like to have Jason Kelsey back, but he doesn't always proffer that in the right way. And people look at semantics and they look at words and they say he's going to be back, and they hear the guy in charge of that saying something completely opposite, and it becomes a bit of a controversy. But I don't think behind the scenes, I don't think necessarily they're not on the same page. I think Doug's well aware that there's a possibility Jason won't be back. I just don't think he's using the right words at times.
We have a lot of more NFL news to get into. I do want to one more thing on yesterday's stuff with Doug, in which was him, say we'll evaluate Jamal Charles. Now, obviously, there's a connection there. Jamal was in at the height in Kansas City when Doug was there, but he did, he mentioned my name, and he did say it's something we'll evaluate. Now, we did kind of talk about this yesterday in terms of Jamal Charles, but with Doug Peterson saying that we'll evaluate, it almost says, nah, that'll throw that one out, because Howie made no real reference to that.
Yeah, and that was another sort of contradiction, not overt, but Howie was talking about building around Carson Wentz with younger players, which is completely opposite of evaluating Jamal Charles. But, hey, I think they evaluate everybody. I mean, evaluating could be getting, together with Joe Douglas and Doug Peterson and saying, what do you think of Jamal Charles? No, he's not a fit. And there they evaluated him. So I don't think that's going to go very far, other than Doug does have a history with him and obviously liked him. But that was a different time, a different era when he was one of the top running backs in football. That's no longer the case.
All right, John, let's look at some of the NFL news. Give us some layers and background on this Scott McCloughan story in Washington, which, I mean, bizarre to say the least, where this thing took a turn yesterday. He basically, banished from being there. They said he'll be back soon. He's Bruce Allen's kind of towing the party line, if you will, saying he's got to deal with family matters. But this is something that, we touched on a little bit yesterday, but it continues to kind of spiral here for the Redskins, who, of course, have the Cousins situation going on. And with your GM in the news like this, kind of bizarre situation that's happening in Washington.
Yeah, it is, and part of the reason is, and probably the irony is not lost, that they play inside the Beltway, because no one will say anything concrete, and there's just constant rumors, and it's fueled by the fact that Chris Cooley goes on the radio, and he's an ex-Redskin, and he works for the station that broadcasts the Redskins, and talks about potential alcohol issues, and Scott had self-admitted part of the reason he left Seattle and San Francisco was the fact that he had significant problems with alcohol. And when he made that charge, it's probably a lot of people said it was unprofessional of him to do that. And maybe it was. But the fact that the Redskins didn't come out immediately and say it was egregious and he shouldn't have done that spoke volumes, especially because it was on their flagship radio station, especially because it came from a former player's plugged into the organization. And now you have family problems. Well, family problems could be a lot of things. One of those things could be alcohol. So it just continues to fester, and I talk about it all the time with the Washington Redskins, and it starts with Daniel Snyder since he's been there. It's a dysfunctional organization. They sort of pit their power people, in this case Bruce Allen, Scott McClugan, Jay Gruden, the coach, against each other instead of getting them all on the same page. And it seems like Washington, D.C., like the irony, as I said, of politics, it seems like there's a lot of backstabbing, and it seems to be continuing.
John, you were talking about Jamal Charles a minute ago. Chiefs GM John Dorsey, unequivocal today, not wavering at all. Alex Smith will be the team's 2017 quarterback. Is Alex Smith on thin ice in Kansas City?
No, I think it more likely than not he's going to be the starting quarterback. However, I think that could change. I think a lot of people, when the Tony Romo domino falls, I think that's going to clarify things for a number of teams. I expect him to end up in Denver. But if that changes and he's available and the Kansas City Chiefs kind of feel like Alex Smith has gotten them as far as he can get them, I think that would change the conversation. But it's a very narrow path where you could see Alex Smith not being the starter in Kansas City, and it only involves really one guy. So the likelihood is he's going to be back and he's going to be the starter.
All right, John, a lot more to get into, of course, over the next couple of days is the legal tampering period. That will begin on Tuesday, and a lot of stuff we're starting to hear now. I mean, the Brandin Cooks stuff. And as we talked about at the top with that, the Titans seem to be in a much better position than, say, the Eagles, and they're the two teams that were mentioned in that report. Titans, Eagles, and I can't imagine, going back to that conversation, John, that the Eagles would be willing to part with the first-round pick at all, whereas the Titans have 2 first-round picks, and they can kind of flip-flop and, have the Saints move up and then move back. So the Titans certainly have a much better spot here in terms of leverage, in terms of a deal like that, if they're the only 2 teams that are really connected here.
Yeah, they certainly do. They're in a lost my voice for a second, but the Titans are certainly in a better position than the Eagles. Now, while we say that, and that's completely true, I think one of the things you talk about in this league is the value of first-round picks, and everybody values that above all else. If you think about it, if you have the 14th or 15th pick, what is the likelihood that you're going to get a receiver that's going to produce like Brandin Cooks has to this point in his career? The odds of that are probably really low. But you're right. I mean, the Eagles wouldn't even consider giving the 14th or 15th pick to the New Orleans Saints for Brandin Cooks. I don't necessarily agree with that because, as I just said, the odds are you're not going to get that kind of player.
It's a huge game. It's a huge game of let's make a deal. Or, it's like, here is what you have, but you can have what's behind door number 2, and you're just so curious with these draft picks that, hey, I got something in my hand, Brandin Cooks. I know what he can do, but, man, I'm really intrigued by what's behind that door. And these teams just can't hold themselves back.
Exactly, and it makes no sense. It really does, if you look at it. Now, if you're sitting there and you think Mike Williams is going to be a star and he's going to be there, maybe you're right. But as I said, the odds are, he's going to run a 4.5, 4.6 at the combine. He's not exactly the most explosive guy in the world. The odds are he's never going to be what Brandin Cooks already is.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say the same thing about you've seen a first-round pick in this very city. And Nelson Aguilar has been, if not the worst starting receiver in football, certainly close to it over two full seasons in Philadelphia. So to go into it and just assume that you're going to be able to get a first-round pick that's better than Brandin Cooks, I think it's a folly. But you're exactly right. I don't think the Eagles would even consider sending a first-round pick to New Orleans.
Would you do that? 14 for Cook. 14 for Cooks. Do you do that?
Would I do it? I would do it and wouldn't even blink.
Okay.
Wouldn't even blink.
More on the NFL.
There's so many question marks with the top three receivers who might be there in this draft. They all have issues, and you have a proven, productive player who's still very, very young.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. Check out his piece on the rumors that are engulfing the Eagles right now, and always check him out on Twitter at JF McMullen, and check out his National Football League coverage on FanRag Sports NFL. John, tomorrow we do it again.
Hey, thank you, guys.